Good evening to all of you. Happy to have you here with us this evening. Tonight, as we have been wont to do over the last year, we're going to be in the book of Mark. I applaud Mark's ability to get right to the point. It works pretty well for these lessons. This actually, though, is one that appears in all three of the first three of the Gospels, not in John, which is kind of common, but in Matthew chapter 17 and Luke chapter 9. But we'll be in Mark chapter 9 this evening when we're going to be talking about a young boy who had some violent sort of spiritual or issues with spirits. And we'll be talking about that here this evening. So we're in Mark chapter 9, verse through 29 is where we'll be. Although we will be looking at a couple other things along the way as well. We are well on our way to being finished with a series of lessons. We don't have too many more left. I think there are 10 more after this evening. And so once we are finished with those, that will sort of wrap things up. I am thinking, and I'll go ahead and let the cat out of the bag. I think what our next lesson is going to be, I have to say this because I'm always worried that Ben's going to jump in and say, we're about to do this. So if it's kind of like putting a flag down. If I say this is mine, Ben can't take it. But I think what we're going to do is do a sort of in-depth study of Jesus's last week on earth. And so it's only 7 days. Be quiet. You can't have it. All right. So, but I think we'll look at that and hopefully be able to sort of glean some stuff from that as well. So that'll probably be, though, more closer to Thanksgiving or Christmas by the time we get finished with this. But I just wanted you to know that that's probably what we'll be what we're going to do next. I haven't fully committed, but about 95% committed to that is where we'll be. But tonight, lesson 24. A boy is healed, because that's what it says in my Bible in Mark chapter 9 at the beginning of verse 14. But some other things you'll see this referred to as a demon-possessed boy, or we've talked about the word demon IAC. Boo, how do you pronounce that? Demoniac. That's what I was saying. But then we got tickled because it sounded like Pontiac, and we were laughing about that in the car tonight. But I thought it was demoniac or demoniac. But anyway, but I don't really particularly like that, because I think this is a little different sort of possession issue than what we've seen so far. We've seen demon-possessed people. Remember, they ran that they drove the demons out of the person, and they went into the pigs. And this is a little different story for us. And I think there's some things, especially if you've known anybody that suffered from like epilepsy or seizures, there are some things in this that will look kind of familiar to you. But it will look familiar. And what Jesus very end tonight, he ends this a little different than the way that he ended some of the other demon-possessed issues. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Unfortunately, not a ton of pictures, but this is a stained glass window. I can't remember where it was, but this is a stained glass window that sort of told the story. We've maybe talked about this before, but a lot of older churches had stained glass windows. In part for decoration, but also in part for teaching. We take for granted the fact that we have a Bible and we can read it and look at it. Even if we're not the greatest of readers, we can still but a lot of people have no ability to read. And so those windows in old churches sort of served as a way to tell that story. Not unlike a little picture book that we would use with kids in their classes even today. That you recognize the picture. And so that's what we see right here, but we'll talk a little bit more about some of that as we go. This may seem like an odd place to start, because we're not talking about Jesus's transfiguration, but that will set the stage for what's about to happen. So I just have a couple of things for us to look at here about Jesus's transfiguration. But I want to ask you first, what does the word transfiguration mean? Definitely. And I think the word there, trans, would be to change or to go across or to move or whatever you want to say. But you see the word figure there. And so this transfiguration, we'll talk about a little bit more here in just a second. Go up onto the mountain, and they didn't quite maybe sort of recognize what they were seeing, Jesus being transfigured. But Jesus, Peter, James, and John had gone up to this mountain to pray. And on the mountaintop, Moses and Elijah appeared, and Jesus spoke with them. This is in, I believe this is in Mark, like just right above what we're going to be looking at. This is the first 13 verses of Mark 9, as well as in Matthew and Luke as well. Moses was a representation of the law. Elijah was a representation of the prophets, while Jesus would be far greater than either. Now, I want to say this, of course, is a picture. I do not have any idea what Moses or Elijah or Jesus would have looked like, but it kind of gave a good, I think it suited the transfiguration, because do you remember what they looked like when they saw them? How are they described? Kind of as a blinding light, yeah. And it was like almost a glowing white light. And you can see on the forefront of the image, Peter, James, and John are there sort of with their hands in front of them, almost like this is too much for me to even be able to see. But I say all that because the lesson that we're going to talk about tonight about the possessed boy appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Mark's is the most in-depth, but it was Luke who stated that this miracle took place the day following Jesus' transfiguration on the mountain. We have seen Jesus a few different times sort of remove himself from the crowd. And we've seen Jesus go into a boat. We've seen Jesus go up on a mountain. Well, Jesus goes up on a mountain. But guess what's going to be waiting at the bottom of the mountain? People are going to be right there, right? If you go up the mountain, you have to come down. There's a movie that was called The Man That Went Up a Hill and Came Down a Mountain. What it was there was this point. In order to be classified as a mountain, it has to be a certain height. And it was believed that, I'm just making this number up, it was believed that it was 999 feet. And he measured it, and it was 1,000 feet. And so it was a hill, but when he came down with the new measurements, it was a mountain. Well, no matter what it is, no matter how high it is, when you go up there, what do you got to do? You got to come back down. And so whatever Jesus experiences in this transfiguration, along with Peter, James, and John, he's going to come back down to what, let's use a word we would use, the real world, right? And who's there waiting for him? All to want from Jesus whenever they come around. Some kind of help, some kind of healing, some kind of issue. And it seems like we've seen over and over various problems that people were facing. And this will be another one of those sort of things as well. Right. Right.
But immediately they recognize.
Right.
I think that's what we'll be, and they will recognize, know everyone can be.
Right. And that's something that that you can have a full, you could teach a series of lessons on that. But we do see that. So they come back down the hill, and this is where we're going to be. Jesus and the 3 disciples who had been with him on the mountain will then return. And of course, there's 9 waiting at the bottom that we've talked about as well. And they had left the 9 that had been left behind, and there were scribes questioning them. So this goes to show me that even though Jesus wasn't present, even though not all of the apostles were there were other apostles, and people were asking them questions as well. Do you remember when they approached Peter in the garden, and Peter denies knowing Jesus? That was clearly wrong, because all these people keep seeing Peter and Andrew and James, rattle all the names off. They had all been with Jesus. And we can see right here, and we're going to read it tonight, that even when Jesus wasn't around, people were asking questions about who Jesus was. So it was real hard for Peter to actually successfully deny, because all the things gave him away, but they've been in this group for so long, people would have known that he would have known him anyway. The disciples, the ones that had been left there, had attempted to cast this spirit out of a boy who was deaf and was mute, but he had failed, but they had failed. And the father of the child pleaded with Jesus for help. And we're going to see that here this evening. Now, we saw a couple weeks ago that Jesus had the person, what was the problem with the person? And he was healed. Partly he said, I saw trees, right? What was the problem with him? He was blind, right? He says, I see men moving as trees. And we interpreted that as sort of blotchy movements that was able to get better. Well, here's an example of someone who was unable to be healed. But who's going to be able to do it? Jesus, okay? How many of you ever been to the doctor's office, but your doctor wasn't there and you had to see the fill-in? Why do we not like to see the fill-in? They don't know us that well, right? They don't know what all the problems. And Lucille can tell you all about this. She goes to the doctor, once every, about every other week. She's over there. But anyway, when this boy is when they're looking to heal this young boy, the apostles weren't able to get the job done. And so what we're going to see is that the father then asked Jesus, because there's a belief, I think this guy can resolve this, can fix this. I found this interesting. This is one of the pictures. It's called Exorcising a Boy Possessed by a Demon. Artist unknown, because there's multiple artists. This is in French. You can see the title, but it's The Very Rich Hours of the Duke of Berry. It's a book. It has all of these different drawings of biblical stories from the 1400s. And I think there's 153 different ones in these drawings. It's in a museum in France, and there's no telling what that would be worth if you were able to come across that. But it was this collection of paintings, and there were all of these different artists that made them, and they don't even really know who made them. And I thought, wouldn't it be a shame to do something this great? And people were talking about it 603 or 610 years later, and your name is just sort of lost, the history. And, the other guy did that as well. But it's an interesting, it's kind of cut off at the bottom, but there's scripture written in Latin that goes along with this as well. But anyway, let's get into what we're going to talk about this evening. Mark chapter 9, we're going to start with verses 14 through 20. Maria, do you care to read Mark 9, 14 through 20, dear? All right. Now, there's several things that we're going to look at in here. I think I've got like 6 or 7 questions for this. So let's don't get the cart before the horse. We'll start with the first and then go to it. But you can see what Maria read there from Mark 9, 14 through 20, sort of a description of what this boy was suffering from. So how would you describe the condition based on what the dad told Jesus? Seizure. Okay, probably you can look at verse 18 and get a sense of it. So let's just look at verse 18 right now, because there's 3 or 4 things in there. The first part of verse 18, it says, whenever this issue seizes him, we use that word even today as a seizure, it does what? First thing it does is it throws him down. Now, I don't know if you've ever known anybody that had seizures. I've had a couple of students over the years that have had these issues as well, but it throws them down. They just sort of have lost control of their body. And we can imagine, and we'll see it a little bit later, how that something like that is extremely dangerous. But think about, why would that be dangerous if this seizure throws you to the ground? Absolutely. You could hit your head, you could hit a shoulder or break an arm or a hip or anything. And so that's not even all of it. But the first thing it says, it throws him down. Then what? He foams at the mouth. And so I probably the closest for that, we think about like rabies or something like that. But you're not really sort of controlling yourself. They used to say that give somebody something to bite down on when they have a seizure, but that's absolutely not what you should ever do. You should turn them on their side. Don't give them something to bite down on. But that foaming of the mouth is probably what prompted that. People think they don't really have control of their tongue or whatever. They would say you could swallow your tongue. That's physically impossible. You can't do that anyway. But he's foaming. He's down the ground. He's foaming. He foams at the mouth. Then what happens? Gnashes his teeth. Well, nobody's going to be gnashing their teeth, but you're just sort of biting down, right? You're just constantly doing that. Then what? He becomes rigid. The word rigid means what? Sort of stiffens up. So you're not really everything. It's funny that everything here is what the little girl that I had a few years in school, like this is exactly what we would experience with her. And you all may be able to relate to that with people as well. And so that is a horrific list of 4 things that somebody would suffer with. But not only that, at the end of verse 18, the dad says, I spoke to your disciples that they could what? That they could cast it out. So he said, I went to the apostles, I went to these disciples and said, can you fix this? And the answer was what? They could not do it. I kind of took the question right there. So I want you to think about yourself in the position of the Father right here. What are you thinking when you're talking to Jesus? Well, why is he asking Jesus for this help? Because he could do it. He was the master. He was the lead doctor, not the substitute, the great physician, if we want to use a term like that. But I'm sure there was a level of disappointment in him that these apostles that were with him were unable to fix that. Because I'm sure this has probably been a problem with this child for some time. So there would have been a level of disappointment with that. Now, absolutely. And we've said that a few different times about a few different things that, maybe don't say it in the Bible, but we can imagine they've probably tried this remedy and that remedy, the home remedy, what grandma used to always say, all this kind of stuff, and it hasn't been able to fix it. How does Jesus respond in Mark chapter 9, verse 19? A little bit, but who does he get aggravated with, I think? I want us to look at verse 19 real quick. I'll give you 10 seconds. Read verse 19 to yourself right here. All right. Now, in your opinion, who is Jesus mad at here? I think at the apostles, right? I think he's mad at the apostles. Now, he can maybe be mad at this man, the Father, but the Father is sort of new on the scene, right? But the apostles have been there forever. Let's look at verse 19. He answered and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. Now, is it possible that there's a little frustration with the crowd as well? I almost think Jesus is mad at everybody right here, right? Maybe just a little bit like, why am I not getting through to you? Ben, you were going to say something. Yeah.
And so the apostles wouldn't have been able to do it without prayer and fasting. It wasn't like they didn't have the faith, they said he was going back the wrong way.
Right.
So I think most of this is directed at the crowd only because of that.
Okay. Other thoughts on it?
I still think it's the apostle just because he says, how long shall I be with you? Well,
right.
He hasn't been with the dad or the boy. He's only been with the apostle.
I think there's an argument for that as well, because at some point, you see Jesus is teaching the apostles with an eye on the future, right? I'm not always going to be here, but when I'm gone, what do you need to be able to do? You need to be able to take care of things. And I went up the hill for an hour and now, and you couldn't handle this situation. And so sometimes we don't have as much nuance in the Bible as maybe you would want. sometimes it would be nice to say, and he said to that man in the red shirt in the third, that kind of thing. But that's not how it always works out. But there's a level of frustration because, again, we're on the 24th miracle that we've discussed. We are well into Jesus's ministry here. And Jesus is sort of repeating the same things quite often about people lacking faith or whatever the case would be. Yeah.
Jesus was, says, well, okay, you apostles are mad at you, then somebody else may not get what they think.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yep.
Bible speaks to you at different times.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes we might be the apostles, sometimes we might be the brethren.
Absolutely.
And by it being ambiguous like that, we can take what we need and take the correction.
Absolutely. The question there, what happens when the child was brought to Jesus in verse 20 then? He kind of went into that seizure. He falls to the ground, wallows, foaming. That's exactly what the dad had said, right? When the dad said, this is what happens to my son, when they bring the son here, Jesus gets to see it firsthand. So it's not anything different. It's not anything unusual. It's not something like, oh, it really wasn't too bad. That's why he was able to fix it, but you couldn't fix it over here. It was quite literally the exact thing that the father had said. Yes, sir. Well, if you're past verse 20, you're jumping ahead.
So it said the spirit was taken from her.
Yes.
So could it possibly be that he really don't have a spirit, that the dad just didn't know what it was, this is a physical thing?
So I'm prepared to hear arguments on this. I've read a couple of different things, and I've read a couple of different answers on this as well. There's some argument that this is absolutely a demon-possessed spirit. But then there's maybe this possibility that it says he has a mute spirit. I don't know if when he goes into this, that's when he stops talking. I don't know. I don't know what it is. And plus, when you're trying to get your 21st century medical advice from a 2,000-year-old book, sometimes there's a little bit of confusion because we know a lot of things then that was not medical practice that didn't really exist back then. And so I don't really know. I say choose your own adventure on that one. I think you can interpret it either way. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Right. And that's what I think it's a debated topic, and I think that there's valid arguments on both sides. So I don't want to say one way or the other. I'll let you make your choice on that. Let's go to Mark. Let's go to verses 21 through 27. Remember, we just finished. Jesus has done no healing yet, but he's expressed a level of frustration, and Jesus has now seen the boy go through one of these seizures. Tom, do you care to read? Excuse me. 21 through 27. Now, there's a couple more verses, but I want to hold off on those for just a second because we've seen the issue with the boy. Now we see in verses 21 through 27, Jesus' approach to healing the boy. Now, first of all, how long had this boy been troubled with these issues? It said from early childhood. And what did the Spirit cause the boy to do? This is not necessarily the foaming at the mouth, but like in verse 21 and verse 22, what happens to the boy? That's why I addressed that at the beginning, because sometimes if somebody has a seizure or whatever, you sort of lose control of your body. And right here, whatever the cause is, It's putting the child in harm's way. It's throwing in verse 22 into the fire and into the water to destroy him. And the child is facing tragedy at any given time, as well as the family, because of what's happening here. But you can see, does the boy have any control of himself? No control of himself. So whatever this spirit descriptor is, has complete control of this boy whenever he's in the throes of one of this. The father asks Jesus what, and then how does Jesus respond in verse 22 and 23? So let's look at verse 20, the back end of verse 22, what the father asks. He says what? But if what? If you can do anything, and I interpret that anything as if you make this just the slightest bit better, whatever you can do. Maybe he still has the seizures, but he's not in harm's way. Whatever it might be. If you can do anything, he follows up and says, have what on us? Now that's the key word. We've seen that quite often with Jesus in these miracles, is this notion of compassion. So the Father is begging for this. How does Jesus respond in verse 23? If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Who does he say that? Who is Jesus saying that to? The Father, not the kid. He's not talking to the kid. He's talking to the Father. Because the Father had enough faith to bring him to where Jesus and the apostles were. Jesus and 3 of the apostles weren't there, but they gave it a shot anyway. Now he's with Jesus, and Jesus says, if you have enough faith, right? If you believe, if you can believe, all things will be possible. Now, that's not a huge request, right? It very well could have been, because I want us to look then at the next question. How did the Father respond in verse 24? He cries. So this is not a, I believe. It's a passionate saying. But he says 2 things that are a little bit contradictory. He says what first? Lord, I believe. But then what? Help. So make that make sense to me. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief.
Get my heart and mind together. My mind is saying you can't do it. This is physically, scientifically, logically possible. But in my heart, I know you can do it. And I know I believe in you. But I still got these thoughts coming into my head.
Absolutely. Mary. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So the front hand, he would have never brought him to Jesus and the apostles if he didn't believe. So there was clearly some belief, but he says, help my unbelief, that perhaps, is what Melvina was saying there a minute ago, perhaps there wasn't enough faith right there. Or what Ben said, maybe try and get these 2 things in line together. And like Mary said, I've got this belief, but I'm doubting the whole way around as I'm getting to it. And I think we can all, like Mary said there, relate to what he says right there. How does Jesus heal the boy in verse 25? He rebukes this unclean spirit, and he says what? Deaf and dumb spirit, meaning, you can't hear, you can't speak. I command you, come out of him and enter him no more. Okay. So this is the first, so that's the command from Jesus right here. Now let's go forward one more. The spirit comes out. What occurs in verse 26? So he cried. It says the spirit cries out again. I don't know how to. I struggle with spirits anyway. I don't always know how to sort of comprehend that in sort of a mind of today. But it convulsed the boy greatly, comes out of him, and the Bible then Mark describes the boy as being what? essentially like he was dead right there, right? And so this spirit that leaves him, the kid is the kid is just sort of just as if he was dead. And I'll say this: the student that I had a few years ago, she had a couple of these during the year. When she was, let's say, quote unquote, over it, she was not at all ready to sit down and do schoolwork. Like she had to leave school. Like she was not able to do that. So when I read verse 26 saying that he was like he was dead, I can relate to that. You know, we use that term sometimes as like, I am dead. I've worked all day, blah, blah, blah. Well, what that means is I just don't have enough oomph. Well, this says the boy was like he was dead, so much so that what did the people sort of think? Many of the people thought that he was dead. So verse 27, what does Jesus do to and for the boy after the spirit was gone? Took him by the hand. So this kid who's there dead, as the people describe, he takes him by the hand, sort of helps him up, and does what? Lifts him up. And what does the boy do? He arose. And so he's better, right? He is better. So Jesus has accomplished something that the apostles, or at least the not Peter, James, and John apostles, were unable to accomplish. Now, the story could stop right there, but there's actually 2 more verses. And these verses are relevant for the apostles. Because why was Jesus able to do it, but the other apostles weren't? Well, let's look at Mark 9, 28 and 29. Will, do you care to read and finish for us here, bud? We've talked about this a few times. There's sort of a debriefing, right, after a miracle happens. And why did this happen, or who did this benefit? Well, this is a valid question that's asked by the disciples. They said, what? Why couldn't we do it? That's a good question. This makes me think that the apostles by this point have been able to do some miraculous things, right? Because they would, if you'd never been able to do it before, you wouldn't ask. You just said, this guy is he's way better than us. We can't do it. But it makes me think they have at least done some things either in the presence of Jesus or maybe even outside of the presence of Jesus to help or to heal or whatever. And so they, go ahead. Yes. 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 So they should have been able to have done this. At least they had the ability to do this for whatever reason. So Jesus responds to them how in verse 29? Say it again. He said, prayer. He said, this is the kind of thing, I'm paraphrasing there, this kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. So let's talk about those 2 things to wrap up tonight. Prayer is what? An earnest asking, beseeching of God for something. Okay. And so this prayer, this idea of prayer, Jesus over and over again do what? Even when involved in these miracles. Pray. He goes up a mountain to pray, or he goes to a quiet place and pray, or he goes away from the crowd and prays. So Jesus is praying. So what should the apostles probably have been doing as well? I probably should have been praying as well. But it also said that in order to fix this, there's got to be prayer. And the second thing is what? Now, most of us probably think about fasting as what? Not eating. But fasting can be any sort of deprivation of anything, right? If you're avoiding anything. But fasting we usually think about it in a food sense. Why do people fast? To focus on what you really need to be doing. But sometimes we focus on eating because it's 7 o'clock, it's time to eat, not because I'm hungry, but that we get it's sort of the physical body type thing. And so I believe here when he says fasting, and you may disagree or you may see this in a different way, but I believe in a sense what Jesus is saying is you're not really focused enough at hand at what we need to be doing. You're kind of along for the ride here. You're performing some miracles here and there. But you're kind of just watching the show a little bit. And I think what Jesus is saying here is a step toward, I'm not always going to be here with you. And if you're not taking care of what you're supposed to be doing, you're not going to be able to perform this kind of miracle or what have you.
And I think you can take that kind of back in verse 19. That's why he was aggravated.
Yeah.
This is kind of 101 here.
Right. Right. Ben?
I think too that Jesus is saying, whenever we have these doubts, like the Father,
Mhm.
or like what Mary was saying, stuff, he said, here's the cure for that. If you don't have enough faith to accomplish what you need to, here's how you get the faith. Set some time aside and pray and fast, and that will increase your faith of how to overcome this doubt.
We talked to a lot of people, most of them are kind of like all of us. That's the good part of it. And there was one lady, she said she had been 10 years and she got 200 different doctors. And she said, I said, they couldn't find the sermon. The lifestyle. So that's the perseverance.
Right.
And you got to have to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You can't go to town like Andy Sauer,
Mike said.
You can't go to town.
Right. And I think you're exactly right on that. And so there's this, and so Jesus healed the boy based on the faith of the man, but through maybe some aggravation of his apostles who weren't, they were with him all the time, and they maybe weren't quite as far along as the man who just showed up had been there as well. Other thoughts on any of that? I think that's a appropriate of that as well. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Like if you didn't hear, but she said I said lesson 24, but she said it may have been lesson 224 in the sense that, that there was probably more happening than this, and that faith should have been growing. But Jesus talks about that a lot, right? He says, when your faith ought to be here, a lot of times, where is it? You ought to be eating meat and you're drinking milk, right? He mentions that.
Wherever we go to that mountain, they just come back and cast out all these demons, having all this success and everything else, and brought back the report to God. Even the demons are set there. So they was on the mountaintop now, and Moses, that's when the devil attacks you most, is on that mountaintop. He comes in there and brings you right back down to the valley. You got the scribes and Pharisees.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It calls down. That's when the devil always attacks.
Sure.
Right after the mountaintop.
So 3 things to go home with here as we wrap up this evening. One, all 3 look very familiar, but one is we never advance beyond a need for Jesus, right? And when we're being criticized, and that's what Ben was saying a little bit. Those criticisms, those are like arrows coming at us, right? We need Jesus in those times. When we're confronted with difficult situations, that's what Boo was talking about there just a minute ago. It's easy to just say, I can't handle this, but that Jesus' help can get us through whatever those difficulties are. And then when we get beat, when we're defeated, that's where Jesus comes in. So, it's real easy to have, to promote Jesus, when you're winning, right? When everything's going good, but that's not how it works, right? For every win, for every trip to the mountain, there's a loss down to the valley. Number 2, we never advance beyond our need for faith. And there was a need of faith in people that was in this story here this night. And the key is direction. Faith guides us in the proper path, right? It kind of steers us in the right direction. But what does the Bible say is a what to my feet? A lamp to my, it's that light to sort of guide our way, right? And that's what faith serves as. But when we turn the lights off, things go from good to bad, just like that. And last one, we never advance beyond our need for prayer. Jesus is telling his apostles in the last sentence, what do they need to be doing? They need to be. Now, these are people. Ben said this a minute ago. They've already went out on the limited commission, and in a couple chapters later, they're going to be sent out on the Great Commission. But he's telling them, the highest ranking, people that are with him, you need to pray. And so if those people need to pray, what about us? We have to as well. We have to as well. And sometimes our failures should be kind of like what the apostles, we need to be like the apostles, because when this was over, what did they ask Jesus? What went wrong? That's what our prayers should be, right? A lot of times we think about prayer and we say, well, this is, so-and-so is sick and I hope they're better. But sometimes what am I struggling with? Like, why is this not working? Sometimes that's where prayer comes in as well. And that sometimes puts a little humility on us as well, right? Because again, when things are going good, I didn't pray. It's not that big of a deal. But when it's bad, what do? Fall right into it. Mary. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. And to say that, Jesus even talked about that. He said some of the hypocrites, they fast. How did they fast? What did it say they did? They sort of disfigured their face and they made themselves, it's like, oh, that guy's fasting. We can do this kind of stuff without letting anybody know. I mean, you could say, this whole week, I'm no social media or no television or no fill in the blank, whatever you want it to be. We don't have to put it in the bulletin. You don't have to like hang a flag outside your house or a sign up saying it, but we can do that to sort of what Mary was saying right there, that the girl that she knew, she had to write her situation. And sometimes we have to do that as well. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. And we can, and that's people do that with lots of things. And sometimes cigarettes or whatever, and it may cause them to quit. You fill in the blank, like you said, but there are things, whatever it may be, that can get in the way of our spirituality, of our Christianity. And Jesus is telling his apostles, you got to fix that. And 2,000 years later, we're reading the verse, we got to fix it as well. Go ahead, Josh.
You can kind of see that sign honestly.
Yeah.
They try to stay a certain way, that way nothing interferes with their Christianity.
Sure. Any others? Thank you all so much.